Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace is not the worst movie of all time. There, I said it. I said it, and it's out in the open. Because when you really think about it, the Star Wars movies are not meant to be compared. They're meant to be seen as one whole unit, as one story. The prequels are about Anakin Skywalker, and to be honest, it's really not that bad. When you look at critic scores and you look at just different viewings of the movie, it doesn't have terrible reviews. Is Episode 1 the worst of the Star Wars? Yes, it is. But is it the worst movie of all time, and does it deserve all the ridicule? I honestly don't think so. I don't think that this movie should really deserve all the ridicule. And I'm going to explain a couple of reasons why, okay? Let's just start from the beginning and what I feel is, like, essentially bad about the episode. Now, Episode 1 is really a setup movie. Episodes 1 and 2 are really a setup for Episode 3, but Episode 1 is really a setup, because it sets up the setup movie. So it's not meant to be very substantial in terms of just any movie. So, let me tell you what I'm talking about. Alright, so let's start from the beginning. Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi are going to make negotiations with this group called the Trade Federation. Now, here's the major problem with the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation is not the Sith. They're not the Empire. It's this political group that sort of has gone a little rogue and corrupt, which, that's kind of the main problem that I have initially, is that it's a political group and not part of the Sith. I mean, you see Emperor Palpatine through a hologram and nothing else to make him, like, ambiguous. And you see that he's younger, he doesn't have that old, frail face that he used to have. But my problem with the Trade Federation, really, is that their dialogue is not very clear. Now, the whole point of the Trade Federation is that they want to get Queen Amidala to sign a treaty so that they can legally invade her planet. But they're doing it in very rogue and corrupt means. So that initially is one of the bad things about it. And then when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan start the first dialogue in the movie, it's not very strong. It's not very straightforward, and it's not very easy to follow. They talk very formally and very, like, just honestly, like, snippy British accent kind of people. It's not like, I sense a problem, or I sense a great disturbance in the Force in this problem. It's too formal and too stuffy immediately. But one thing I will credit the episode with is it gets into the action quickly. When I think about A New Hope, and it does immediately have some sort of action going on, but it's not the same, because what happens in A New Hope, after the entire opening of A New Hope, where C-3PO and R2-D2 are put in an escape pod, and go down to Tatooine to run away with the hidden plans for the Death Star, it gets a little it drags on. If you remember A New Hope, it really drags on until they meet Han Solo and blast their way out of Mos Eisley. So, this movie does pick up on the action very quickly, but the whole idea of the Trade Federation, it just doesn't flow well. One thing I will admit, though, I was just watching it recently. I watched it yesterday with my little brother, and for the first time. And I was trying to explain certain things that were happening because I knew that he wouldn't get it. But as kids, we didn't understand completely what was going on either. All we knew was that the Queen had to escape somehow. So, but before I get to that, let me also address another problem I just realized I need to address, is Jar Jar. Now, everybody really mocks Jar Jar a lot, and he's not exactly that funny, but he's really not the devil that everybody makes him out to be. So, you get a little bit of backstory with Jar Jar, and you kind of go back and forth with the Trade Federation and then the Jedi and such, but it progresses quickly. The meeting they have with Boss Nass isn't entirely dragged on for too long. They get across what they need to get across. It's hard to understand what the Gungans are saying. I constantly had to tell my little brother what they were saying because it's so difficult to hear what they're saying. So, that in itself is not exactly, it's not exactly the best. But as you keep going on, it continues in like a pretty orderly fashion. And I have to admit, they do get the queen out of Naboo rather quickly. It kind of happens very at a brisk pace. It keeps to the pace of the movie, and I felt like I was watching the movie, and 30 to 45 minutes into it, they were already on the starship going to Tatooine. And I thought, wow, this is already happening. The main part of the story of Anakin Skywalker is already going to be happening. Wow, that was really quick. So that's one thing I do praise the movie about. And so the next thing is the introduction of R2-D2, I think, is great. Just the fact that he's still the same little droid that winds up saving everybody. He's the strongest one of the group. And then they go to Tatooine. Now, everybody constantly gives the little boy who plays Anakin, Jake Lloyd, a hard time. I don't think he's a terrible actor. If you all have seen like other terrible movies like The Room, where there's other kids that are older than him playing these very cheesy roles, I think that he salvages it. And I think really it comes down to bad direction. Because how George Lucas, or whoever was the director, decided to direct the characters, they made them very stuffy and very formal. But I felt like some of the dialogue between him and Padme wasn't exactly that bad. I honestly like when he calls Padme an angel and asks her what who she is, and like, oh, how beautiful she is and stuff. I kind of think it's very innocent and very just, it's not super romantic, but it's not super cheesy either. And as the story goes on, I don't really mind him. He especially his relationship with his mother. I feel like his mother is very restrained, but she has as much of a motherly instinct and a motherly character to her as she can with bad direction. I honestly think it's just bad direction. The screenplay isn't even that bad. The dialogue itself is bad, but the whole story between it, and how, one thing I like that happens on Tatooine is when his mother, Shmi Skywalker, is trying to explain how she conceived of Anakin, and what happened, and how there was no father. And then Qui-Gon is trying to put this all together and piece it together while communicating with Obi-Wan. And meanwhile, there's still another problem, that there's still Naboo officials that are on Naboo, and the Trade Federation is trying to trick the Queen into sending a distress signal, into sending a contact hologram, and communicate so that their location is given away. And Obi-Wan has to make sure it doesn't happen, and Qui-Gon has a lot of things on his mind. But the whole way they deal with Anakin, just Liam Neeson's performance and Jake Lloyd's performance, I think it's very strong. And I feel like the story of Anakin Skywalker is very well thought out and well played. The fact that they can't get off the island, they can't get off the planet with the monetary values and credits that they have in order to buy new parts. So Anakin introduces this idea of pod racing, in which you get to win. It's very, I don't know how to explain it. I just like the way it's thought out. It's very, the rest of the movie is very quick, so that when they get to Tatooine, it's very slow and very focused on Anakin, but not too focused, whereas you start to lose the effect. Like when Qui-Gon talks to Shmi Skywalker, it's very quick. When he's checking Anakin's blood and he's testing for the midi-chlorians, it's very quick. It's very to the point. And Qui-Gon and Shmi Skywalker's conversations are very restrained, but they're very quiet. They don't have too much dialogue, and the dialogue they do have, I admit, kind of gets a little stuffy. I feel like I'm using the word stuffy a lot at one point, but it's not terrible, and I think that it progresses the story well. Now, the pod racing scene itself, I will admit, does get a little bit long and it gets a little bit dizzy. But the whole idea behind it and the stakes, not only do they get the credit for the ship, but now Anakin gets to be set free. It brings like this new kind of dimension into it in a way. And then not only that, you have Darth Maul too. Let me talk about Darth Maul a little bit. He has very few lines, and I kind of like that about him. I'll get to his fight scene in the end, but his role in it, where he literally only has 2 lines in the whole movie, and the Emperor, or the mysterious Sith, has ordered him to go and find the missing ship, the missing Naboo cruiser. And once he does that, he's just this very mysterious and shrouded figure, which I like. I like how he doesn't really have a lot of character development because they have to introduce the idea of Anakin. Like I said, this is a setup movie. So aside from Darth Maul looking cool, it's not exactly... There's really nothing else that there is to him except that he's a mysterious Sith, and he introduces this idea that there is still only 2 Sith. One master and one apprentice, and that's all there ever is, and that's all there ever will be. Or so we think, and obviously so we know, because we've seen, hopefully, the original trilogy. So, I kind of like that, and then as the story progresses, they go to Coruscant. Now, here's what I also don't like about it. The CG and the visual effects are amazing. Do I think that there's too much of it? Yes. I mean, there was one point where they had the transition of going from that platform that they land on to the Jedi Council. They literally have this, like, minute and a half, 2-minute shot of the city, which, if you really count 120 seconds, it's a long time. They show one cityscape, and then another, and you think it's done, but then there's more, and it just keeps on dragging on. The whole thing with the Jedi Council, once again, stuffy. Once again, the dialogue is not very strong, but the story itself is not that bad. But then, of course, you have the rest of the story. Now, here's how I get through all the diplomatic and political problems of the movie, because there are some of it. But when I was watching it with my little brother, he really didn't take that much thought into it, and yet he kind of still knew what was going on. And if you simplify it, you can kind of overlook the bad dialogue and the overly used, like, big words and all this political garbage, because there's 2 scenes that really bother me. One of the scenes is when they're in that one room with all the moving platforms, which, first off, I think is a great design. It's just so Star Wars. But there's so much bantering back and forth between all these political groups, and you have no idea what was going on. I had no idea what was going on, and I technically knew. I tried to listen, but you still don't know what's going on. All you really need to know, if you think of it this way, that Chancellor Valorum is reluctant to help Naboo because they have their own problems. Senator Palpatine thinks that they should help Naboo, but he doesn't really have that much of a power. And then the Queen wants to obviously save her people, wants to go back there, is not going to sign a treaty, and wants to change the senator. That's all you really need to know. It's like a 5-minute scene of all this unnecessary banter back and forth. And then the scene between Queen Amidala and Senator Palpatine is kind of not really that necessary either. And it's way too formal and stuffy to be interesting. But then it does cut back to the Jedi and to Anakin's story a little bit. And you kind of get a little more interested and a little more invested. Then, once you go back to Naboo and Jar Jar realizes that the Gungan city has been evacuated. It's been deserted. So now, the Naboo people have to make a deal and an arrangement with the Gungans to join together and fight, because they're only going to be able to fight together. And it's almost like an improbable victory. Once again, they're kind of mirroring A New Hope. But the one thing I do like is that once it does happen, there's a real conflict. I feel like the problem with Episode 1 is that you had the war of the rebels against the Empire in the original Star Wars. And even though it was a backdrop, it was Star Wars. And I understand why they have to introduce the Trade Federation the way they do, because you have to set up this new war, because you have to kind of establish how these things happen. And the one thing I do like, and one thing I will ask you to put in perspective, for those of you who hate the prequels, next time you watch it, is that the reason they show the big room with everybody from the Republic all bickering about political issues is because with the Empire, they don't show that much of the Empire and of much of their problems, because they control the entire galaxy and there's already chaos, and the rebels have to try to appease the Empire and kind of like deal with that chaos. So in the originals, you have to have a good framework of how there is structure, but that structure is being like manipulated, and the structure is sort of like starting to crumble, and that's how the Empire got started. So I do admit that part of it is good, but the fact that there's really no war in The Phantom Menace is really my big issue. I mean, you could argue that there is, but I view the Battle of Naboo as more of a battle. really. Like, I don't really see it as more of anything else. And the battle itself is really great. They don't specifically center on the Gungans that much. They kind of go back and forth between 4 parts of the story. The Gungan battle, the battle with the Queen, with Padme and the rest of her guards, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan versus Darth Maul, and Anakin piloting that one ship. And they add those parts very slowly so you can kind of see what's happening, let that sink in, then you get cut to a new thing. Stuff happens there, kind of gets resolved, it kind of lets it sink in. And it's a decent way to run the movie, because when you think about it, you have the Gungan battle, which you don't really care about, because most people hate Jar Jar anyway, and they say it's sort of meant to be a distraction. They have a strategy. Then you see Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan with the rest of the people of Naboo. You kind of see them fight, and then you see them get captured, and it's kind of a standstill when the droidekas come and capture them. I don't know if you guys are remembering what part, but I just watched it, so if you watch it, you'll understand what I mean. But then they quickly cut back to the Gungans, and then the Gungans are losing. Everything seems to be losing hope. Then they cut to Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon fighting Darth Maul, which I'll get to that in a second, because that needs its own attention. And then later on in the fight, you see Anakin flying, which it's kind of, yeah, it's supposed to mirror Luke Skywalker a little bit. Some of the stuff is dumb. Like, I don't think a 9-year-old would really be reacting. Even if he is a good pilot, he'd be reacting as calmly and comedically as he does if he was forced in the middle of a battle, of a war, and all that good stuff. And then, of course, he uses 2 torpedoes to blow up the Trade Federation and stuff like that. It's, the way you gotta think of it is, yeah, what is it, luck? No, it's really because he's the chosen one. You have to think of it as fate there, because as Obi-Wan said in A New Hope, in his experience, there's no such thing as luck, and in the Star Wars universe, there really is no such thing as luck. It's all what's meant to be, and especially in the prequels, because you already know what's gonna happen. But as you move on, then I'll get to the Darth Maul fight. Now, since we didn't have that great of dialogue, and like, we had an okay story with pretty decent flaws in it, the one thing we were treated to, and Star Wars fans were treated to, because this was the first movie that came out after the original trilogy, which, keep in mind, the biggest sword fight was Luke versus Darth Vader, and it was really more of the rebels. So you get this fantastic fight, not against 2 people, but 3 people, one of which is a Sith with a 2-sided lightsaber, and this great, like, fantastically choreographed fight. You got jumping and flipping, you have different sword fighting moves, and it's just a great fight with such a tragic end, and you start to see, like, the anger of, you see a little bit of anger in Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you see just different sides of everything, and it brings to, it sets, like I said before, it's a setup, and it brings to light many different things. The fact that Qui-Gon was originally going to train him, so now Obi-Wan does. It's like all you know about the past is whatever Obi-Wan tells you and what Yoda tells you in the original trilogy. Now, you have this guy Qui-Gon who has been brought in the picture, so now there's a whole different feel to it about how Obi-Wan didn't want to train him and that everybody else didn't want to train him and they sense fear in him, but Obi-Wan promises his dying master. And it brings about this new perspective about training Anakin, because Yoda and Obi-Wan sort of have this respect for Qui-Gon, and they're almost sort of forced into it because Obi-Wan has Qui-Gon's defiance and he's going to train Anakin no matter what. And it's just, it brings about this new feel to it. And then, obviously, the ending is sort of like celebratory, which is kind of why I don't really see that as a war, more as like a battle, and like I said, a setup movie. But, I don't know. Overall, let me kind of just sum up the movie. What do I like and what don't I like? Well, the story of Anakin, I do like. I like the story. I don't love it, but I like it. I like the different twists and turns it took. I like the different characters it added in to kind of set up why Anakin feels this way and why this happens, and sort of the backstory with him leaving his mother and how sad he feels. Him giving Padme that little trinket that he makes for her, and all that stuff. But I really like the story, not the dialogue. Let me make that clear. I don't like the dialogue, but if you simplify the story in your head and then kind of watch the movie from that perspective, I do really like the story. The dialogue, no, the dialogue is not that great. In fact, it's really, really not that great, but it's manageable. The characters, as much as they're made to be these flat characters, they are pretty interesting. If you take away the fact that it's the dialogue and the direction, which those are 2 pretty big things, which is why I understand why people don't like them. If there's bad direction and the characters are directed to act in a certain way, there's really not much you can do in terms of changing them. And if the dialogue is not good, it doesn't matter if the story is okay, because the dialogue is what drives the story. But if you can kind of ignore that a little bit, I think that you'll like the movie. Obviously, the problems are there's too much of the Federation and too much of this, like I said before, hokey dialogue. The Queen wants to save her people. The Trade Federation needs to legalize their invasion of Naboo. The Chancellor doesn't want to help them, and the Queen wants the Chancellor out of power. And then, in between, you kind of have the Sith going back and forth, that they're kind of working with the Sith, and you do get a little bit of a villain, a perspective of villains, because you have the Sith that's sort of controlling the Trade Federation, and you can see that the two aliens, Nute Gunray and Rune Hako, they're very, very scared, even though they're these grand leaders of the Trade Federation, because it's really a political group. So it's not the Sith, and it's not the same thing. So you do get certain levels of villainy. Speaking of villains, I think Darth Maul looks fantastic. The fight was choreographed perfectly. I'm kind of happy they didn't do too much with him, because like I said, kind of like a beginning episode to introduce the other episodes, and really not a character that was supposed to be strongly developed. Jar Jar, yeah, he's not that great of a character, but to be fair, there is less of him as the films go on, and I honestly think the action is so much better. You can totally get into more action quicker, and just more action in general than in the original trilogy, and I just think that for what it's worth, I think that it's not that terrible of a movie, and I really think that you should really re-look it and give the actors and the characters the credit they deserve, give the story the credit they deserve, while also knowing that the direction that they were trying to go for was not the strongest, and the dialogue was god-awful, and so much harder to accept. Although, you have to kind of get this background about how the rebels came this far, and how civilized and how strong of a political group and an organization that the Jedi were, and that just everybody else were. So, I do like the setup. The CG was used a little too much, but the visuals are so much more stunning than in the originals. The action is so much more better. The characters are bearable and manageable, and I don't think that the new concepts they introduced are really that bad of concepts. And I feel like the more that you accept that, the less that they're going to be adding Gungans into the end of Return of the Jedi, or Hayden Christensen instead of Sebastian Shaw as the ghost that appears to Luke. So, just keep that in mind. Not that bad of a movie. Come on, look at it. Come on. Really not that bad. I enjoy watching it. It's all about balance. It's all about balance. It's the one that all 6 movies are a saga together, and it's nice to have that balance of the original that was made at a certain time period, respect it for being one of its kind, then just accept these for kind of adding onto the story, creating more to the Star Wars mythos, adding more action, a little more CG, a little less with the story, but still, it follows the story and it does its job. I mean, they're making episodes 7, 8, 9, so these movies were clearly not that unsuccessful. They made a ton of money. People are still watching them. Honestly, they were my childhood. Episode 1 and 2 were really my childhood because my mom didn't know much of Star Wars. So, you know what? Not that bad of movies. Clearly not better than the original, but bearable and worth checking out so that you don't get sick of the original and that you kind of have that balance of prequels and originals. So, that's all I got to say about that. That was kind of my rant about episode 1. I'll be back soon with episode 2. I'm going to watch it today and hopefully post it. And so, see you guys soon.